Welcome to the Hazard Class Podcast. This is the podcast where I ask my stupid questions of some of the smartest people in and around the world of emergency services. My guest this week is a career fire service leader turned assistant commissioner at the Minnesota Department of Public Safety. He's a former fire chief and emergency manager, and now one of the people responsible for how Minnesota prepares for and responds to emergencies statewide. It's my pleasure to welcome T. John Cunningham. John, thank you for joining me. Appreciate it.
Thanks for having me. This is great. I appreciate the opportunity. It's good to see you.
Of course, yeah. It's great. I don't frequently, get people from hometown. I search the country. I've talked to people across the world, but it's nice to talk to a hometown guy. So that's great.
It's awesome. And if we weren't kind of in two separate areas right now, I'd say we'll just get together for a cup of coffee. But yeah, this works. So
this is great.
I appreciate it.
For sure. All right. So long storied career in many different facets of public safety. We can't get to all of it until we get to how it started. Let's go back to the very beginning. Why public safety? Why the emergency services?
Yeah, that saying of never forget where you came from, is so true. So, I really owe everything today, in my career path and kind of this commitment to public service back to Greenwich, Connecticut. I was around 13 years old, only child. My mom's like, you need something to do other than just, sitting at home, getting into trouble. I was actually a pretty decent kid, but, I needed to get out of the house and kind of befriended a couple firefighters that were at the Sound Beach Volunteer Fire Department in Greenwich. And she's like, there's something called this Fire Explorer program, and I knew nothing about it. And it's young, eager kid, and they gave me like a Firefighter 1 book, and I have a learning disability too, so I tacked that on top of that, and I go, let me read this book. Well, I read that thing like 6 times, and this is what I want to do. Mm-hmm. And at 13, I joined the Fire Explorer program, which at the time was actually sponsored by the Greenwich Professional Firefighters Local 1042, the union in town, and I spent many days, many nights, down at the central headquarters on Havemeyer Place, just learning everything about the fire service. I had no one in my family that was in public safety. Most of my family was in Wall Street and did, executive, leadership and banking. And that is not my strong suit at all. But yeah, it was just something that I wanted to get involved in. And, I do, everyone as a kid kind of has that, dream of, cop, firefighter. I freely admit that I kind of had that identity crisis, I think at a really young age, because there's photos of me dressed as a Connecticut state trooper. I'm like, I want to be a state trooper. And I still have the utmost respect for cops. So I will say that. But, I sat in a fire truck and everything just kind of took off from there. And when I turned 18, actually was even 17, now I think about rollback time, I was able to apply as an associate member at the Sound Beach Volunteer Fire Department in town. And they actually had the technical rescue program. So when I got involved in the fire service as an explorer, I just loved technical rescue and diving and USAR and all things surrounding like the tech rescue program. And Sound Beach actually had that. So I joined and was able to get voted in. There was a day way back in time that, they would have a waiting list. So I felt really special to get voted into Sound Beach, and kind of the rest is history, as they say, and rose through the ranks as a volunteer firefighter, had really great relationships with the volunteer fire companies across the town. And, the numbers of volunteers back then, were about 100 or so throughout the town of Greenwich and split up in all different fire companies, working alongside a career firefighting workforce of about 105, I think, at the time. So yeah, it was great. Learned a lot. When it came to the college, my dad's like, well, let's go explore colleges. We did the whole, New England, Gettysburg, all the Marist and Poughkeepsie and all these different areas explored to go to college. And I ended up picking Fairfield University. And I think my dad knew the reason why. And I loved everything about Fairfield, but I wanted to be close to home. I just wanted to stay in the fire service and continue to give back. And I had actually the opportunity in 2009. I was like, what do I do for my career? And I was doing some teaching in the tech rescue space of the company out of Florida, loved traveling the country. When I graduated college, I ended up having my own technology consulting business. And then that IT bubble burst. So I'm like, yeah. I love the fire service, but what the heck am I going to do? Because I want to stay active, but I was a volunteer. There's no compensation. We had a health insurance program, but I knew I needed to make a decision. And I started looking online, and I was getting my master's at the time in Homeland Security leadership through the University of Connecticut, UConn. And fire chief jobs. I was 20, in my mid 20s at the time when I started that program. And I'm like, what do I want to do? I love the leadership role. I was an assistant chief, got into district chief at Sound Beach at the time. And I'm like, and I just want to get active in the fire service. And I just love that leadership component because I grew up with some really strong leaders. I love, just building teams. And I'm like, how do I transfer that over? And I realized that I was still young, but I really just wanted to focus on that. And Elk River, Minnesota, I had a job posting for a fire chief emergency management director. And I'm like, well, that's unique. Put my name in the hat, sent my resume in. And I remember getting a phone call. I was at the fire station. They're like, we'd like to interview you. And I'm like, who is this? Because I was getting rejected all the time for emergency management jobs. And that was kind of history. And moved out to Minnesota with 2 dogs and ended up having to bring my mom out because she was disabled, unfortunately at the time. And we're all getting up and moving. So it was a cross country move. It was fun.
So what was the state of Elk River at that time? Is it fully volunteer, a combination, or what was it?
It's a good question because, coming from the East Coast, you really had defined kind of fire service models. And that's what I was used to, that you either had full career departments, you had strong volunteer departments, or you had like those traditional combination departments that were starting to move, towards a full-time staffing model, but still had a very robust volunteer system. So those were really kind of the 3 structured fire service models that I knew. And when I looked at the Elk River job, I was a little confused, I admit, because Minnesota was really doing something different and really continuing that to this day of having full-time leadership, fire chiefs, but running a paid on call. And that was a word that I actually did not know either. It's like, what's this word or this phrase paid on call? Because it's not volunteer. It wasn't part-time. It was a different structure. But really using a volunteer workforce, that then gets paid when they are responding or training. So that was kind of the blending of kind of 2 different models that either, volunteer or career, but looking at something different. So it was really unique to me. And I had to learn a lot when I came to Minnesota just on what is this new structure? What we have pension programs for volunteer firefighters. So a quick learning curve. And I freely admit when I look back, I was 29 years old. I thought I knew a lot, but I learned a lot, and just any leader that says that they stop learning is full of BS. I fully admit that because I continue to learn to this day, just new things, and especially in a leadership role of trying to learn something new coming from the East Coast to the Midwest and, learn a little bit about Minnesota culture too, because that was the other piece. I'm an East Coast guy and sometimes that comes out. And I had to tamper that down a little bit. So it's like, sorry. And they didn't even know in the office. I'm like, if you don't want to see East Coast John, come out. So, but sometimes that does bubble up.
And so you do your time at Elk River. How long are you at Elk River before you make the transition to Brooklyn Park?
It was about just over 8 years, I want to say. And, time flies. When I was in Elk River, it was a struggle as a new, fire chief, younger fire chief, building, trying to expand an organization, but recognizing that we had to grow towards the future. So we did a strategic plan. We hired some more full-time leadership positions, and improved our inspection program and our volunteer firefighting workforce, and then started to really lay the foundation of building new stations and investing into the department. But then the Brooklyn Park chief's job opened up, and I knew the chief at the time, Ken Perlman. I got a chance to know a lot of the Brooklyn Park firefighters. And every kind of point in my career, I really wasn't looking to make a move, but those opportunities came up, and looking at Brooklyn Park and their values and the things that they're involved in, as well as just the opportunity for growth, because Brooklyn Park was one of those cities that is growing. It's like the sixth largest city in the state. Ran at that time about 8,000 calls, and with 6 full-time firefighters on staff. And I'm like, this is a huge opportunity to say, where can we take this department? So I put my name in, went through the process, got hired, and was there for just shy of 5 years before I went to the state.
So all that leads me to go, and if we go back to when you took that job at 28, you say, with Elk River, how does somebody at that age come into a department as an outsider and, earn the respect of that agency? Because it's an uphill battle, I would imagine. You probably had people on the department that were substantially older than you. Now you're coming in to say, I'm in charge. How do you manage that?
There are some stumbling blocks along the way. I mean, I fully admit that I look back and there's things that I do differently. I had to tamper, some of my enthusiasm at times, because, at 29 and going into 30, I'm like, there's just, I'm eager, I want to go. And I think, people were really watching, who's this young kid? And we had a very senior department at the time that, there was some significant hesitation to change, and, don't kind of mess with what we have. Things are fine. And I don't, I don't take that lightly at all, because the tradition and history in the fire service is so important. But we also have to grow, and we have to, look towards the future, because we can't sit still. I remember buying a bunch of the Paul Combs, cartoons, and having them in my office, because he was able to illustrate so articulately of, some of the challenges that leaders face on, embracing change and kind of growth and, health and wellness, and some of these things that are so important in the fire service that we just can't stand still. So, I know that I had people that were wishing I left, but I was committed, and I was committed to serving the community. And I will say that what kept me going is this is about those that we serve. I mean, first and foremost, I don't care if you're volunteer, you're part-time, your career, any of those models, staffing models, but the very top priority is those that we serve. And as a chief, I need to put the best people in those positions, that when that 911 call comes in, that they are able to step forward with the best training, the best equipment, and the resources to do their job effectively. So, that's always been my driving, passion is, how do we serve those that when they call on their worst day, that we're able to actually answer that call. So, to kind of get back to your question, it was a learning experience, I think, for me. But I wanted to demonstrate to those that, I'm a listener. I want to build a successful team, and I want to grow an organization. But, it's a challenge, especially for someone coming in from the outside into an organization, into a culture that's just maybe a little bit different, but to earn that trust, but also to just keep the mission to those that we serve, looking at, are we able to deliver the service that when someone calls and their house is on fire, that we're able to get there and actually solve their problem. So I'm very happy about what we did. I look back and I still live in the town. The chief today, Mark Dickinson, is continuing a lot of the work that we did way back then, including the development of an entire fire academy that was created internally, not only for the city, but then now they have surrounding departments that are coming in train new firefighters. So I look back, and that's just a proud moment, because like those things are continuing forward, and it's about the mission and putting that first. So, I don't look at like age, as a defining factor. There's so many different things that define, someone's, ability to be successful. But I think it's, humility. It's leading with empathy and compassion, and caring about your people. So that's always kind of been my thing. But I worked a lot of hours. I look back on my Elk River days, and I was like always on call. I mean, and that was, I have a lot of respect for, volunteer paid on call chiefs that always have to be available. And that's, they work a full-time job. They have to work extra hours, and, they are just always working. And I think we see that across the country on just some of the fractures that we're seeing in the fire service overall, of just the time commitment and the requirements that come with positions, especially for leaders. And, sometimes it's lonely at the top, and I try to surround myself with a personal board of directors, as I like to say, right? And know people that are a lot smarter than me when I have problems, so I can reach out to. So it's pretty.
Yeah. So as you go from, the volunteer side to the paid on call side, now you finally land in Brooklyn Park in full time. How did the lessons you learned along the way inform your ability to lead a career department, knowing full well all the experience you had from the volunteer and the paid on call?
Yeah, it's every position is unique. And I when I started in Brooklyn Park, I said that there's three things. I'm going to look, listen, and learn. And I really tried to do that very intentionally, is to, hear from the firefighters, hear from the community, what are the challenges. And I had the fortunate opportunity to work in various staffing model departments. And I actually went back to my Greenwich days, and some of my best mentors were career firefighters. Even though I was a volunteer, there's sometimes rivalries between, full-time and volunteers in some areas of the country. And yes, those things, I know they still exist, but that didn't matter to me. Like, we were all there to do a job. And these were, brothers and sisters that frankly helped raise me. And when I look back to my Explorer days, some of those mentors that I had back then really helped develop me into the man I am today, both on the volunteer side and on the career side. So it was about people. And when I started in Brooklyn Park, I realized just how significant of an investment we needed to make into the organization. And we made headway, in the previous years before I came in. And I realized that there's an opportunity to take it to the next step. So we immediately did a strategic plan. We brought in an outside facilitator to focus on kind of the 50,000 foot level. But then I worked with our leadership team at the time to say, okay, how do we operationalize this? Like, what do we have these deliverables? We realized that we need to improve our response times, our deliverables to the community, and then, work with the city council to say, like, we need to hire more firefighters. We recognize that the history and the tradition of where the community was. Brooklyn Park had such a rich history in volunteerism in the department, with all the stations, with 4 stations that kind of had their own unique identity, with district chiefs and a paid on call staffing model. But that just wasn't working in a modern organization that we needed to improve, and we needed to make that investment. And we did that with full transparency. We had community involvement. The union was involved. Our volunteer leadership was involved. And we ended up having to make the difficult decision, but it was the right decision to dissolve our paid on call program and invest in 2 full-time firefighters and hiring full-time firefighters. At that initial investment, we actually also made the decision, which is something very similar to Elk River, but a little bit different, to create a fire academy model and to recruit from the community and to put our new firefighters through an intense multi-month fire academy, including EMT. So we really tried to recreate some of the successes that I knew from the East Coast, from the Connecticut Fire Academy, to some of the things that I had in Elk River, but just some of those best practices on how do we best serve, the Brooklyn Park community with that focus. And the union was extremely supportive. City leadership was supportive. The mayor and council, because this was a significant investment. And I think that, most cities don't realize the financial investment and the capital that it takes to really have a functional and a very successful fire department. And things are continuing today. So it's neat to see.
What's the key in going from a fire chief that understands the logistics of managing a fire department to conveying that information to a council or a mayor so that they understand it at least enough to make the investment make sense? Because it's so obvious from the inside to say, oh, we need more firefighters, or we need, whatever, better hours, or whatever the thing might be. Inside the culture of the fire service is generally relatively easy to see it. From the outside looking in, I feel like there's a disconnect because it's just they're not speaking the same language. How do you, as a fire chief, be the translator?
Sometimes translation is hard because I would spend hours trying to figure out the best way, like you said, to translate what I'm seeing as a fire service leader into something that a civilian could understand and then put that into motion from like a policy or a budget standpoint. And I think there's two things that I realized that as a chief, and even some of the senior firefighters in the department when I was hired said, like, chief, we need you to be a chief. It's great. I know you want to go hop on a truck, but like, we need you in your office. We need to make this investment for all the reasons that you just said, because like that translation is so important. And it was painful for me sometimes to see the trucks going out or know that there's a house fire going on, that I want to jump in my squad and run out the door, or grab my jacket, go hop on a truck. And don't get me wrong, there was times that I would do that. But I also need to spend the time to make sure I'm investing back in the department. So as a chief, I realized that my value, if I want to support our team, is to advocate and to make sure that I'm articulating those needs to my boss, the city manager, and then also ultimately the city council. But I can remember when we were trying to operationalize this strategic plan, right? So you have your strategic plan at like a 50,000 foot level. So, we want to have these outcomes and have a fire truck arrive on scene in X number of minutes. Well, that's great, but how do you actually make that happen? Like that's a big task. And when we talk fire services, that's not just one person. You need multiple people, you need multiple shifts, and then you need trucks and all this stuff to make it happen. I remember I had probably a 60 deck PowerPoint slide and I did not present every single one of them, but I had like every scenario that I could possibly think through. And I ended up just using like clip art of little firefighter icons to articulate like every various scenario. And if we went down like option A, this is what this looks like. If it's option B, here's what this looks like. And that really became instrumental when we went to apply for a SAFER grant, because I needed the council support to apply for it. And there was, back and forth. Well, let's ask for 12. How about 9? And I said, I need 12 firefighters, like right off the bat. I wanted more, but I realized that we couldn't have, like, there was just a capacity issue, and we didn't want to bite off more that we can chew at that time. So, but I remember having all those slides, trying to translate the firefighter world, because I see the passion. And one of the things in Brooklyn Park, I think it was frustrating when I started is the folks would say, Chief, we've been changing. There's all these promises. We'll get there. I said, I understand. Just bear with me. Like I have to articulate this message. Thankfully, they trusted me to do that, and I think we delivered. And they continue. Now they're building a brand new central station. That was the next kind of piece. Funny side note: both in Elk River and Brooklyn Park, I did strategic planning and fire station assessments and plans for that. Up to the point that then the shovel went in the ground and I ended up leaving to go to, another department. So I've never actually had the benefit of actually like working or sitting in a new fire station, in a new office. But, that's okay, because it's like, I know a lot of times as leaders, the path that you create, is those that benefit are going to benefit, years after you're gone. And I'm seeing that in action, and it's proud to see.
Yeah. So one of the big things that you accomplished in Brooklyn Park was that fire academy. And so obviously a paradigm shift for that onboarding process. And when you go about doing that, how did you go about deciding what mattered to cover inside of that? How long is it going to be? What topics need to be covered? What must be covered? What could be covered? I imagine this is like a community project in terms of your chief officer staff and stuff, but I'm sure you were instrumental in that. How do you go about deciding that there's so many things? You could have a 75-week academy if you wanted to, but there's plenty of things to learn. But how do you decide what is necessary?
Yeah, is hiring the right people. And I knew in order to do that, I needed a leadership team that could focus. So we actually created a new position, a deputy chief of professional standards. We posted that and hired that. Jovan Palmieri ended up getting hired into that spot. And I tasked him, I said, I need you to create a fire academy like from scratch. And, for those, listeners that are joining, from especially other areas of the country, you might say, well, yeah, we have this, on the East Coast and on the West Coast, like you test into a department and then you go to a, 4-month fire academy program. Like Connecticut, you would get hired, off of a list. You would take your CPAT exam, your physical agility. You do a written test, and then you go to this fire academy. And that was my vision. And we did 2 of those rounds. We actually did a written test in the Armory, hundreds of people showing up. They took the written test, like Minneapolis and St. Paul. I know something very similar, but that's not standard across Minnesota, mostly because, departments are transitioning very rapidly from a volunteer paid-on-call workforce to a career. And, the hiring practices are just a little bit different. But I really wanted to focus in on being able to get the best talent and train to the best standard that we could. So we created really everything from scratch, but using the best models. And we also don't have a training center in town. So that became a little problematic. So the team got very creative. We were actually able to approach the local technical college that had a fire training tower that was essentially abandoned, not being used. So we cleaned that up. We couldn't burn in it, but we did everything else there. And, the men and women went through, a very rigid, fire academy program, including PT. And I am not in great shape today. That's been one of the things on this new job. And I was just thinking, like, we bought echo bikes, we did fitness, and really raised that bar. It was just neat to see the whole team come together and invested into the graduation program. And it was really cool to see. And I think that those models are so successful because of, bringing the team together, but then also just the hiring standards. Like we were really intentional about the testing process of, hiring the best of the best, and then training to the best of the, best training to be the best firefighters that we could be. And, often, one of the things that we also realized too is a lot of times in Minnesota, going from a volunteer paid-on-call department into a career department, that was actually one of my bigger concerns, because that's a different model. I mean, it's just, you are now at the station. You are being, always ready to go. There's performance standards. You're out the door. You're training a lot more. And I wanted to make sure that we educated everyone enough and got them ready for what does that 24-hour work schedule really look like, and to set everyone up for success, the department, but most importantly, the new firefighters that we were hiring. And I know a lot of those same programs are continuing today, just to make sure that we're training the best of the best.
Yeah. And the hiring process, especially, I mean, even in the last decade or so, I've been in the fire service, it is that we're seeing decreasing numbers of people applying for jobs. And I just did a podcast yesterday, and we were discussing kind of at length about, I don't quite know why. The career doesn't seem to have changed much. Granted, I think there are more potential applications that you can put out now. There's more places. When I got on, there was like 5 departments in the state that you could work as a career department, basically. But that hiring process is finicky. And so how do you go about selecting the right people? And moreover, when you inevitably make mistakes in that hiring process, how do you make sure that those people that come into the organization don't become cancerous to the organization as a whole?
That is a good question, and something I'm passionate about. So kind of the first part about that is, one, I think that the dynamics have changed today, right? I mean, people have options, especially as I look in Minnesota. A lot of departments are hiring, and they're hiring fast, and culture matters. So like the culture of your organization really does make a difference. But one of the things that I realized too, and I think it's still true today, is like we have to do a better job at marketing the fire service. Like we can't just expect the public to understand what we do, and we have to be honest. We have to tell our story. As I do cringe at some of the social media videos that are more modern today. I will fully admit to that. I'm kind of showing my age and my old school salty self, but let's be proud of the profession. I mean, this is truly the best job in the world, but we have to create those opportunities, and I think especially for departments that are in that transitional stage, of going from a volunteer paid on call workforce to full time, of trying to tell that story, but also giving people those opportunities to be full-time firefighters. There were many firefighters, and some are, many are still there in Brooklyn Park today that we hired off that first ever academy. And I know one firefighter that literally drove by the station, saw a sign, put his application in, never thought about being a firefighter before. He gave his heart and soul into that program. It completely changed his life. He's growing his family. He's financially stable. Then this is a job that he is so passionate about. But that was someone that was not the quote traditional firefighter that came up through the ranks, that he just drove down, the street and saw a sign. And I kind of look back when I was that 13, 14-year-old, sitting at Lupinacci's Deli in Costco going, I never thought about being a firefighter. My dad is still horrified that I'm sometimes in public safety. He just gets worried about, are you safe? Are you doing this? You're my only child. I don't want something to happen. But I know how important that advertising and just that, we need to tell our story and get people involved to step up. And it's a challenge. But I think we need to, articulate, to the community, why this is such an incredible job and why do people want to get involved. But it's also competitive. People do have options today, and the culture of an organization matters. And as a leader, and I'll maybe transition into kind of my new role, at DPS, I had the opportunity to build essentially an entirely new leadership team. And when I look back on that, my newest director that we brought in from the outside of our Homeland Security Emergency Management team, I remember sitting down with her and going, this is where I want to take, things going forward. Things are changing, the threat landscape's changing. We're opening up a brand new state emergency operations center. Let's be innovative. Let's look towards the future. But I had the opportunity to build a new leadership team with a new state fire marshal, all my directors. We moved some things around. We actually just posted a new leadership position today, a brand new position, oversee a board that I chair. But it's so important to have the right people on your team. And I believe in coaching. I believe in setting expectations. People want to know what you have as expectations for them. And if they're not meeting those expectations, work towards it, coach them, train them. And sometimes we're, as leaders, we miss the boat on that. We don't do a good job of setting people up to success. And then we wonder, well, what the heck happened? And I always try to reflect, did we do everything on our end to help this person be successful? And if we've done all that, we also then have to turn the accountability piece. And that's okay. It's hard. I'm a people person. I like to, get consensus and have people be in harmony. The worst thing for me is having to let someone go. But I also understand that the worst thing for an organization is to keep someone on that is bringing the organization down. And you mentioned that cancer, like we cannot let that permeate throughout an organization. We have to take action. We have to hold people accountable. We have to have expectations, and because the public has those expectations of us. And I'm the first one to admit that I look back on my career and I wish I could have done things differently, but I've learned from them and hopefully become a better leader because of that. But it's all about having the right team, and those that are firefighters understand that importance of a team. And I look at my job today as really administrative. I'm not used to wearing a suit and tie. I'm a firefighter at heart. So, but having a team is so important. You as a firefighter, when you hop on that truck, you are relying on those 2, 3, 4 other people that are sitting next to you to work next to you. And if you get in trouble, to save your life. And I see how important that is. And if you don't have that trust and you don't have the training, the skills, and the equipment and the right people, like your team's going to fail. And you just have to make that investment.
Yeah. As we think about recruitment, retention, how do you think the emerging, maybe it's not emerging, but more prevalence of the discussions about job-related cancer and PTSD and some of these, unfortunate negative side effects of the fire service. How do you think that affects our recruitment and retention? And how do you think organizations prioritizing dealing with those issues affects recruitment and retention?
Yeah, I'm a very honest and transparent person. So I think there's a balance there. Like we have to be open and transparent. Like there are risks associated with our profession, without a doubt. I look back on my career, go, why the heck did I do that? I used to carry my turnout gear in my pickup truck in my front seat, breathe all that stuff in. When 9/11 happened, I was in college. I went to Ground Zero. I worked next to FDNY and NYPD and as a college kid, and made amazing connections there. But Billy Quick, a decorated FDNY firefighter who I met there, passed away from 9/11 related illness. So, this is real and personal. One of my mentors, Johnny Fronio from Greenwich Fire Department, passed away, in job-related illness too. This is real stuff. But what I will say is we're doing a lot of great stuff in Minnesota through MidFire and other initiatives to support health and wellness of firefighters. But it's also on leaders. We have got to really be intentional about changing our culture and really living by those values of taking care of our firefighters, giving them those right tools to whether if it's health screenings or encourage physical fitness and other things to stay shape. This job is so demanding on people, and I think we owe it. If you're going to be a firefighter or a first responder, you got to take care of yourself. And I was watching a TV show last night with my husband, and it was a ER show, and they're doing CPR on a child, and I broke down, and he's like, "What's wrong?" And I said, "I just had flashbacks to a young girl that drowned in a pool in Elk River." Those are the things that pop up, and they're like, that was the first time that's happened in probably over a decade. But those things are real, and they might pop up, but you have to have a good support network. But leaders have to live those values. And I look at social media. I watch it, and I do cringe. It's like if I see full beards on firefighters. I love the mustache, by the way. I cannot pull that off. But a full beard, I know, are you doing interior firefighting? Is this because that's just not the standard that we have. Yeah. And I get that, culture comes in, but as leaders, we've got to set those expectations, very clear and take care of our people. And as a chief, that was one of my commitments when I was from Greenwich to Elk River to Brooklyn Park, and now my new roles. I don't want to go to another funeral. That's, and unfortunately that is something that I've not been able to truly live up to. because, we've gone to so many funerals of our brothers and sisters, including, St. Paul and other major departments in Minnesota. But we gotta step up and take care of one another. And I think we're acknowledging those threats and those real dangers. But I also want to encourage people that if they are interested in the fire service, this is still an amazing job, but we're doing things to counter those threats and those risks. And I think as leaders, we need to articulate that, but we can't just do it lip service. Like, we actually have to do it. Mm-hmm. And I think that's the important piece. It does affect, I think, recruitment and retention if we focus on the negative, and that's where we need to balance that and say, this is still the best job in the world. I mean, even though I'm not an active, fire service, member anymore, but I still support it from my role. So it's truly the best job. We have amazing community. We have amazing teams, and we do amazing work. There's not many jobs that you can go home at the end of the day and say, this is so amazing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So as you get towards the sunset of your time with Brooklyn Park, and you look to move on, right? Talk to me. We talked a little bit before we started recording about that moment, but talk to me about like the opportunity you saw, your decision to step into the role, and what that was like to kind of walk away from the firehouse and move on to the bigger firehouse, down at the state capitol or wherever your office is. Do you have a Capitol office?
No, we're actually in a corporate office building, so we're like on the other side of the highway. So
okay.
I get to go up there sometimes, but we're not we're on the other side.
Okay, but So what was that moment like when you walked away from the firehouse to go do policy?
Yeah, it's during towards the end of my time in Elk River, I was elected as the president of Minnesota State Fire Chiefs Association, where I served actually 3 terms in that role, and ended up stepping down when I took the state job. So I knew a little bit about the policy side, and I realized just how important that is to advocate on a state level and to build coalitions and to really advocate for the Minnesota Fire Service. And actually, when I was running for the state chief's spot, I was traveling around the state, and I love getting out to some of these small town rural departments and just seeing like how are they making things happen, and what makes this department tick, and how are they addressing recruitment issues, retention, equipment, and funding. And I realized that there were some real challenges there, and how do we support them? So that really kind of planted that seed on this is a statewide strategy. We are one fire service, and we like to say that as the brotherhood and sisterhood of the fire service. And I looked at my role of this is true, and how do we operationalize that? And we tried to do that, as state chiefs. And then COVID happened, and kind of our mission shifted a little bit. We lost 2 years of as everyone kind of that blur, right? Mm-hmm. And the governor appoints the commissioners, and the previous public safety commissioner was not seeking reappointment, and Commissioner Jacobson was appointed as the public safety commissioner at DPS by Governor Walz. And he invited me out for a cup of coffee, and I'm just thinking, okay, that's great. I'm the president of the State Chiefs Association. That's great. He's a great networking guy. And we started talking about halfway through our coffee. He's like, so I got to ask you, do you want to come on as an assistant commissioner? And I almost spat my coffee out because I was not expecting that. And that was probably one of the hardest decisions really of my life, because and I don't say that because I didn't want to take the job. I absolutely love my job. We have a great team, but we had so much amazing stuff happening in Brooklyn Park that I really had to reflect internally. I talked to my husband, is this the right move? Yeah, we're doing great stuff. We're going to be building this new station. We're hiring firefighters. We got a great culture that's happening. Things are just going in the right direction. And, one of the things that I've said a couple of times, refer to my husband as, I'm gay. I'm everyone now knows that, I'm married. We've been together, Jake, for over 12 years. And that when I went from Elk River to Brooklyn Park, my husband made a comment to me at my swearing in ceremony. He's like, I've never felt more welcome and accepting here. And I even reflect on that. I mean, it makes me choke up because that's so important to me. And I think that, Brooklyn Park demonstrated, and they put their money where their mouth is and said, you're family, we treat each other like family, and they welcome Ben into that environment. So all these things were really on my shoulder of like, I'm going to make a huge move. And I also knew I was going to take a significant pay cut, which, I do not make wise financial career decisions sometimes, but, I discounted that as, this is about the mission and it's about service. Money doesn't frankly mean as much to me as it is, as important as the mission is. So, I said yes. That was a hard decision to make, and when I left Brooklyn Park, there was a lot of tears. They escorted me out of the city, and I was bawling the entire time because it was a really hard decision to make. So I've been at the state for over 2.5 years now. It's kind of a blur. We've had just a few things going on that have been on our plate, but. I just look at that as it was kind of that opportunity, and I knew I couldn't say no to the commissioner. And there's it's been a stressful couple of years for us in the Department of Public Safety, especially this past year with the assassination of the Speaker Emeritus Melissa Hortman and her husband and dog Gilbert, who I knew personally because she was in Brooklyn Park. And I helped lead that funeral planning and coordinate that for the family. And then we had the Annunciation School shooting. We have all this federal immigration stuff happening today. So, it's been a heavy lift. But we come into the office and everyone there has said it is we have an amazing team, and all of us have been singing the chorus like we could not imagine doing the work and the heavy lifting that we're doing without the team that we have. And that just goes back to kind of my early days. Like, you have to have a great team. And I could not imagine, not having the team that I have. And when I took the state job, we had an opening in the fire marshal division as a state fire marshal. So I asked Dan Cryer, the Brooklyn Park fire marshal, to join our team. And he did. And of course, the Brooklyn Park team's like, you cannot poach anyone else. So I think they got scared every time I'd walk in the door afterwards. Like, you can't steal anyone. But honestly, it's about having a good team. So, I mean, that's kind of how I made that transition, and, building that successful team and engaging with stakeholders. And, for all of the divisions that, I now oversee, so it's the State Fire Marshal Division, it's Homeland Security, Emergency Management, it's the Emergency Communication Networks, which is the statewide 911 program and the 911 system, as well as State Safety Oversight and Office of Pipeline Safety. That's the in-ground pipelines, as well as rail safety. So there's a lot going on, and I also chair the statewide emergency communications board. So there's just a few things.
Just a couple. It sounds like.
Yeah, but it's fun. I got a great team.
So that really transitions me perfectly into the next question, which is, coming from the fire service, rise through the ranks, manage multiple departments, then you go to the state, and now you have to really diversify the things you're overseeing. How do you go about getting spun up in all these things? I'm sure you had some sort of relative knowledge of these things, but now you're no longer just leading a singular fire department. You're now leading all the fire departments, and on top of that, all these other facets you just went through. How do you even manage to know what the hell is going on? There's so much going on, right?
Well, there's days that you feel that your head's going to spin off, but one is my leadership team is exceptional. I trust them to do their job. I'm not a micromanager. If they need help, I'm there to help answer questions. And just like specifically like to the fire marshal division, when Marshal Cryer started, I said, we need to build relationships with our stakeholders, with our fire chiefs, with the fire marshals across the state. Let's rebuild that. Let's look at things, towards the future. Our state response teams are also under the fire marshal division. We need to focus on that as well. Whether if it's our 2 USAR teams or hazmat teams or bomb squads. But let's focus on our mission and make sure that we're addressing what it is that we're supposed to be doing by statute. And the one thing coming into the state that everything that we do really has to have a tie back to what the legislature has authorized us to do. And unlike a fire chief and a city council, I can just go to the council, and hey, I want to do something. I just put it on a council agenda in a week. Things are a little bit different at the state. So, for me, navigating, that structure, and it really took me a couple of years through legislative sessions to understand, like, what is that process? How do we navigate it? But kind of that buffer and trying to understand and educate, chiefs and associations, like this is how the process works. But, I really have to trust my team that they're operationalizing things on the ground. But one of the things that I really go back to is, my roots in Greenwich, that I like to have relationships, and I like to make sure that all of our public safety entities are connected, that they're working together. And that's so valuable and important to me, especially when we look at like the issues that we're facing today. And even though that I directly oversee kind of the emergency services branch, I work very closely with the State Patrol, with the BCA, with all the other divisions that are within DPS. That when there's a challenge, like we bring people together, whether if it's I'm making a call to the Adjutant General at the National Guard, making sure that all the people have a seat at the table and that have a voice, because we're dealing, sometimes with some very complex issues, especially when they're emergent issues that we need to address, and making sure that we have everyone at the table and that we have our stakeholders engaged and that we're serving them as well. So it really has transitioned my mindset, a little bit of like, how do we best serve, Minnesotans really as the entire state, recognizing that, we have staff that are all over, but, we're here to support, one another and get out in the communities and support our local first responders, support, the 700 plus fire departments and fire chiefs that are out there, our emergency managers, our telecommunicators. And that's been kind of the neat job for me is being a connector and building those relationships and, sitting down with people like yourself or chiefs to say like, hey, what's the challenge that you face? I may not have all the answers. I freely admit to that. I may not be able to actually directly solve your problem, but I can probably connect you to someone that can.
Mm-hmm. That's another good transition to this, this pervasive issue inside of how do we go about dispatching fire departments. And obviously it's not just fire departments, but it's also EMS. It's also police. In terms of, it seems like we've overwhelmingly moved to a pro QA system in terms of how, dispatching certain units for certain things. But it seems like there's a brokenness inside of the 911 system. And it doesn't seem like it's easily rectified. Just based on whether it be the caller not necessarily understanding what resources they need, or the dispatcher not necessarily having the capability to make a decision based off of the Pro QA system. My understanding, like I'm on the dispatch committee for the city of St. Paul, and it doesn't seem to be a way to get away from Pro QA based on the litigious nature of everything. I don't know if you have any thoughts on that, but I would imagine as the chair of the communications board, you would have some thoughts on the dispatching system and how we could potentially work to make it better.
Yeah, it's I've had my hands in kind of the techie side of the emergency services business since a young kid. I mean, I had my own tech company and did a lot of website and database work, and then love radio. So it's like falling into this job now has been kind of fun, and maintaining the statewide radio system with our partners at MnDOT and serving as a chair of the statewide emergency communications board is exciting. And I actually used to be a board member way back in the day, but specific to your point, I actually attended a class. It was a 2-day class, but 2 weeks ago now. Things are a blur. On next gen 911 and demystifying the next gen 911 kind of ecosystem. And Minnesota actually is just closed a request for proposals to engage a facilitator to actually develop a roadmap for the next gen 911 system. And without boring all the users on all the techie stuff, but I'm really excited because when I sat in that class, it got my attention again, because I'm like, there's a lot of possibilities to move from kind of this E911 system to reimagine what is the 911, and I would say, how do you get emergency services help system into the future, and how do you leverage technology? How do you leverage AI is becoming an emerging issue and an opportunity too, but how do you leverage all these things, and what does this roadmap look towards the future? Because Minnesota has an opportunity. Some states are a little further ahead on this next gen 911 transition. Some are just starting. We're kind of in the middle of saying we have a good understanding, but we need a solid roadmap. So what I will say is that, as I've committed, is like we need to hear from our stakeholders. And then part of the strategic plan is to hear from all of our public safety stakeholders about what are your challenges, what are the things that are important to you. Let's bring everyone to the table to get a shared understanding. I think sometimes the fire service and doesn't really have a strong voice when it comes to like the dispatching systems, and most CAD systems aren't intuitively designed for a lot of the work that we do, or it's such specialty. So I think there's an opportunity to have good collaboration about reimagining, just as a state level, what does this next gen system look like? Because the things that I saw are the capabilities, and it's going to require a lot of policy input and a lot of stakeholder engagement, saying like, how do we better collect data? How do we better use data? And then how do we improve that 911 experience? And when someone has a really bad day and they need help, how do they get help? And I'm kind of being intentional about not even saying the word 911, because I think that there's like, it's really summoning that emergency services. We have so many different things and sensors and tools that can alert emergency services. And I look at like the boundary waters, for instance, that, what does satellite technology look like, in the future, that we now might have connectivity to areas that we've never had before. So, the state's role is maintaining that core network, the actual, like when you make that 911 call, making sure that it gets from, if I were to call 911, it gets to the closest public safety answering point. But now as we look at the future of next gen 911, it's going to be vitally important that we hear from our stakeholders and say, okay, what are your challenges? Because when we make this investment from law enforcement, from fire to EMS, but then also some of these other ancillary services, man, it's like public works, like who's the federal agencies maybe in your jurisdiction that we might need to call, or at PCA or hazmat resources or state teams, we can now have a much more robust approach. And the other piece to that, if you can tell, I like having I like strategic planning because we have a roadmap towards the future. The other thing that we're doing in Minnesota is we work with the legislature last year, and the governor signed into law a requirement for the state fire marshal to do a statewide fire service assessment. The RFP just closed on that. The fire marshal is working on awarding that contract. But that is going to be a statewide fire service assessment on kind of where are we at today, and what are the challenges, what are the maybe some of the opportunities, what are we hearing in the Minnesota Fire Service. And so a lot of that's going to be data driven and saying, can we get records, can we look at response times and rosters, and how many firefighters are there and what does training look like, and there's some deliverables that are outlined in statute. But we're one of only a few states that have taken on such a huge task. But as I look at my role now, we have to get a good understanding of where we're at before we look towards the future on it. Because it's going to be, I think, a multi-phased program. That this is just the assessment. Like, let's get a good assessment. The Office of EMS and previously the EMSRB, Dylan Ferguson did a really good job of using their data to kind of tell a story. And I kind of look at this as that next opportunity for the fire service. Like, what's the state of the Minnesota Fire Service? So then the next phase, then we can look at how do we address some of those real issues? Because, you mentioned recruitment and retention. I sat through a recruitment and retention class probably when I was like 16 or 17. I don't even think I was active in the Sound Beach at the time. I just was able to sign up. It was one of those classes I didn't have to be 18 because it was a classroom thing. And I remember like back then that we were talking about this issue. And I don't think that we've across the country have really just dove in and said, like, what are we actually going to do to address that? And like when we talk about recruitment and retention, I actually want to go down even a step below that and say, okay, what are we trying to accomplish? Like when we look at the public, what are their expectations? You can have a roster of 60 people, but if you only have 2 or 3 firefighters that are able to show up, Monday through Friday, 9 to 5, like, is that really meeting the expectations of the community? So, I think it's a both and. Like we have to engage, at the community level and say, well, what's happening? What are the deliverables? If someone calls 911, back to the 911 discussion, that's when the clock starts. Someone calls 911, like, that's 0000, and then everything that happens after that is an intentional act, right? The time it takes to process that 911 call, the time getting the right resources dispatched. What are those resources? Is it the right resources? And how many people? Because we are still a labor-intensive service, right? So we need firefighters. We need trained firefighters. They have to have the right equipment. So I think all of this is coming into play. So, especially for those that are in Minnesota, pay attention that there's going to be a lot of opportunity to have engagement, whether if it's the next gen 911 system or if it's the statewide fire service assessment. And then we're also doing what is the future of the ARMOR radio system, which is Minnesota's statewide public safety radio system. So there's a lot that's happening at once. I'm going to probably overwhelm a lot of our stakeholders, at least in the state, but this is where I look back on my career and say, what, I've been in those roles. I've been a chief. I've been a firefighter. Now I'm in a leadership role at the state. Okay, these are emerging issues. Let's have a plan, whether if it's 911, if it's ARMOR, if it's the fire service, and let's create a solid path for the future so that, if there are policy, recommendations that we can make, to the governor or to the legislature, that we can help support, public safety, in general.
So with so many decisions now are so data driven because we have the capability of having data that we previously didn't. Yeah. Is there any fear that we could become too data driven? The specific thing I bring up is rumor mill we hear sometimes is the idea of like peak hours staffing and stuff like that. And from a firefighter perspective, peak hour staffing is very scary to me because you say, yep, we maybe go on less calls overnight, but what are we going to tell the mother when her house is on fire and we don't have as many resources as we should because the data says we do less calls overnight, right? So how do we balance anecdotally knowing what we need versus what the data says is the hard facts when we know that the emergency services and emergency response is chaos?
Yeah, and I think that's where strong leadership matters, and that's where experience matters, because data is one piece of that puzzle. And I think for the longest time, we have never had good data. And I would argue today, we still don't have really good data. But we'll find out, through this assessment, just statewide, kind of where's our data at? That's actually one of the deliverables. Like, do we have enough data to actually make some big level decisions or recommendations? But as a chief, and I'll go back to even like decisions say is, and I'll use like homicide or gun violence victims, that a lot of times we talk about like data points, that there's been 12 homicides, whatever the data point is that we're looking at. But every single one of those data points is a person. Like, that's we can't lose sight of that. That when I look at the Annunciation school shooting, like we can talk about data, but there's a name associated with every single one of those victims. Those lives matter. Those families are impacted forever changed. So it is a both and that we have to look at, the data, but then how does that tell, the story? And I think we do need to be mindful that we don't consistently chase data around too. And that I'm always very conscientious about making significant changes based on limited data sets, because you want to look at trends and like, is just this one-off, or is it, something bigger that's happening? I'll look at like call volume, like for instance, and a lot of times we're a really busy, fire department. We respond to 1,000 calls a year. But then, like, what does that data actually look like? Okay, well, what are those calls? How, like, is it, are we rolling every truck, or are we rolling, is it just like a duty officer type person that's rolling out the door? Or, how many calls are structure fires? How is that taxing on our members? And then how many like redundant calls or back-to-back calls? And, as a chief, like, I could walk into the office and tell what the mood is pretty quick. I mean, you can have one structure fire that wipes everyone out, or you can run back-to-back cardiac arrest calls and people are still exhausted. So, it's really about connecting both of those pieces and understanding, like, what is the data telling you, but then how does that impact the community? And the one piece that I think gets lost sometimes, and I kind of go back to, when we first started talking, is like, we're here to serve the community, and we have to involve the community, in these discussions. And as a chief, I want to try and articulate, this is what the data is showing. These are what this is what is my professional recommendation. This is what we're able to deliver as an emergency services organization. But then what is the expectation of the community? And I think sometimes there might be a mismatch or just a lack of understanding of the community expectations. And I look at like City of Eagan, that really was, when Brooklyn Park was growing, Eagan was also doing that transformation at the same time of, transitioning their department. And for them, it took like really one significant fire. And I think a community member saying, like, this is just not acceptable. Like, my house burned to the ground. And so some of those stories are so impactful that, you can talk about data. And I remember as a chief, I'm so proud of my staff and my team, whether you're a career or volunteer or paid on call, but, for volunteers there's only so much that they sometimes can do. It's like you're working multiple hours, you're putting in, family time, and if you're a dual income family, you might be working 2 jobs, and then now you have volunteer duties on top of that, at this fire station of learning, your EMR or your EMT training, your firefighter training. But we also have to tell the community, back to your point about like, are we educating everyone? Like, this is what the commitment is. And are we struggling to recruit people just because of the demands? And every community is so unique, but we have to involve the community in those decisions. And I really, value the partnerships. Like in DPS, we have a community affairs division that is, really tasked with building those relationships and hearing from communities and working with communities across Minnesota. But at a local level, like, how do we engage with our community? Do they understand if this is the change, especially when you're thinking about making significant change? like in Brooklyn Park, when we said that we're going to make this transition, we did a lot of legwork at the front end. And there were some people that had some really pointed questions, and I don't mind getting those questions from community members of like, I don't agree with this, like explain, as long as I have the opportunity to try and sit down and explain. I love that opportunity, even if it's, someone that may not necessarily agree with it, but I want to provide them with the data and the facts and then the personal stories that connect to it.
Yeah. So as I kind of look to let you go here, give me a quick view to the future from your office, right? What are the hopes for 26, 27? What do we want to accomplish in the near future?
Yeah, for us, it's at the Department of Public Safety, it's continuing to serve Minnesotans. We have a great team. We have exceptional, divisions that work and our staff that are serving, across the state. But it's really about service. And I think when we look at our stakeholders that are in public safety, whether that's law enforcement or fire, emergency management or EMS, whatever it is, of like, how do we support them in some really difficult times, recognizing there's just a lot happening. And I think, for those divisions under me, that the strategic planning that we're doing is like, we're here to listen and hopefully create that plan towards the future, that we have a good grounding of what we're hearing from our stakeholders, but then recognizing that things change. And, going back to that Paul Combs, analogy, I know that I have that graphic of like the horse and carriage and some other things. Like, we are constantly changing, as a public safety profession. And I know for anyone that's in the fire service, change, can be hard. The two things, we don't like where we're at today and we don't like change, but I look at it as progress. Like, we have to evolve. There's so many things that are happening. How do we work together? I think recruitment and retention is going to be huge. Our numbers, like, how do we get people into this profession? How do we keep them here? How do we keep morale up? But I will tell you, it's like, I've been active since 1998 in the fire service. I do not regret one decision that I made to get into this profession or career change, to move to Minnesota, to take that leap of faith. Even when my family's like, "You want to be you're going to move? Like, what are you doing?" But sometimes you just got to take that chance, and you got to take that step forward. And I think that I'm seeing in the fire service, especially, new leaders come up. There's been a huge change in at least the Minnesota Fire Service, of new leadership coming in, of kind of that fresh blood, new perspectives. And I'm excited to see that energy and to see what happens in the fire service, but just overall, emergency services in general. I know, there's a handful of sheriffs that I know personally and professionally that, are not running, for reelection. So I think we're going to see, a lot of turnover, in some law enforcement, within EMS, within the fire service. But, those that are interested in getting involved, like step up. And that's been the other kind of piece of, don't be shy about getting on to committees, about stepping forward. That's kind of a Minnesota thing that I've realized too. Like, sometimes people don't like to actually step forward, and I'll put emails out and say, "Hey, we have this opening," or something, but I really have to go out and like connect with people. Like, "Hey, Jake, you got this talent here. I want you on my team." We got to do more of that, because there's so much exceptional talent out there that I love to see. I'm excited to see where we're going to go.
Awesome. Well, thank you for the work you're doing. Thank you for the work you're doing on behalf of the fire service and the state of Minnesota. And thanks for joining me and spending time talking.
Yeah, thank you so much. And thank you, listeners. I appreciate it, and look forward and be safe.
Awesome. Thank you.